Hello and welcome to the Ghostly Bear Games video blog. We record our day-to-day meetings as we work on our first game, In Search of a Home. These are unscripted, lightly edited segments from meetings that cover engineering, production, and design. Let us know any topics or questions you might have in our Discord. Thanks for watching.
Cool. So what I want to do, and we can keep this as short as it needs to be, or we can take time where it needs to go, is just go over the sprint planning board and look towards release 8 and release 9, and make sure that we have on there, we're prepped for planning and we have a good idea of what the next couple sprints look like. Um, and so if you guys want to open up that board and start taking a look, this is sort of what we had groomed last time as sort of like release 8 being like, hey, we're going to be on Steam, so there's a certain amount of time that we're just going to be spending updating that and making sure that it's good. We'll be going live Thursday of the first week of the sprint. So it's not going to be Monday, but it'll come up pretty quick. And then we also talked about basically working to get the first big content update started, which we had sort of prioritized the faction design stuff. And then I also know that we've sort of been talking about the some of the resources and underlying stuff that came up again in the design time yesterday with George. And so I think what we said was that we were going to spend next sprint's design time doing some of that game design stuff for that, similar to how we did faction design stuff this sprint, so that we could implement it the sprint after that, which sort of makes the which makes sense with the long range update being sort of our next priority after faction update. But I know we've done a bunch of design work and sort of thought through all the stuff, so I don't know how many of these cards are still relevant or are now misnomers for things as the features have changed. So let's talk through what's there and what we want to change and what we want to swap out.
So just before we jump in, one of the other things we've talked about in the last two sprints is that we were going to be analyzing the content that we have currently in game in terms of events and quests and things of that sort, based on the playtesting that occurred over the last couple of weeks, to try to figure out if we felt like we had enough content in and enough variety in that people were not going to be experiencing the same, at least for the first, I think we were targeting 3 playthroughs. Do we feel like we're there, or is that something we need to make sure that we are either utilizing those new features to fill those out in release 8, or do we need to actually create something that is a call to action for that in release 8?
So I think part of the conversation that George mentioned was he feels like we need more. We do need more content. Specifically, he sort of described needing more like rarity in sort of things and resources and stuff that you find, and he described it in a way that made a lot more sense to me, which is basically right now the resources we have kind of feel like they're all the common version, and he'd like to see some more variety that is more interesting and more rare and change things up, and that lets us have RNG. And I think that coincides nicely with some of the things that Ant and I have sort of off and on talked about around resources and sub resources and resource types and quality and some of that stuff. And so I think that is a major push of content that he's interested in, that I think is what I mean by some of the design time stuff to talk about next sprint. And I think some of that stuff may be faster to implement, and so we may even be able to do some design and implementation of pieces of that next sprint. So I do think that there's that, and that should also give us more hooks to then start pushing on the other content pieces, like adding more events or whatever.
Okay.
I don't know how other people feel about like the pieces of content we have right now. The only major content thing I have is just going back now that we have sort of the world design stuff and the faction stuff, just going back through and rewriting what we have just to be more flavorful.
Yeah. I added one card at the bottom of backlog, which ties into the resources thing, which isn't about rarity. It was something I've been sitting on. I wish I was at the design time, which was as a player, I would like depth to how I generate specifically morale, power, food, and fuel, which is somewhat separate from a rarity standpoint. That can build into it.
Yeah.
But I'm actually talking, I put examples of like, only way I have to generate really morale right now is Grand Celebration or Jump. And maybe a random event that shows up. But I don't have I could only dump things to that. Like there's a thing of like, can we tie that together with food and saying like I can click my little food button next to my food icon and it brings up a little slider and I say I want to double the amount of food I'm rationing to my people. And so now every time they eat or stagnation happens, it's mitigated. Like just things like that start tying even our small common resources together in more interesting ways to give us more variety in like what we offer people and choices they can make.
Yeah, and I think that fills in micro stuff.
It does in a little way there. I in the card at the bottom, I have a number of examples and things that I was just thinking of. And I think that is not, as I said, is separate from quality and rarity and things like that. Like that just adds they work together, but yeah, one is easier I think to implement right now than building out like resource rarities and
yeah. I mean, go ahead, Will.
Is it worth talking about this idea more in depth now, or is this more of a bounce off it and we'll do it in a design time later?
Design time, I think later, most likely.
Yeah,
but it's mostly as like, is this a worth? Unless there's an objection of like, this is a bad idea. Don't go down this route.
I like the idea of having more things that the player can do. There are some specifics that you mentioned that I have quibbles with, but I think we can talk about those in design time.
Yeah. So like the appropriate thing right now is along the lines of like, should it be in release 8 or should it be in release 9 or should it be farther back? And I think it makes sense for it to be in release 8, and potentially in release 8 as both a design and implement. But I think that will come down to potentially breaking up the card during planning. So I don't know that we need to get to it right now.
Yeah, we've identified it as a thing that we want to do for design in the next sprint.
Yeah. Also, the thing that you described seems like it could tie really nicely into the faction stuff that Brendan was talking about last time. So that could be both things at once.
Yeah, I think that's like an approval.
That's exactly what I was thinking.
I see you, Will.
I know that we have a bunch of faction cards. I don't know how I think I wrote a bunch of them, like literally 6 weeks ago. So
no, I'm reading through them. I think they're actually correct.
What's faction visuals?
Iconography.
Iconography and I would define it as having one identifiable character or representative per faction. Like we should have some kind of recognizable character for them. But the iconography is probably the most important.
What would you call the map that you had talked about, or the visualization of the factions themselves,
or the faction map? You mean?
Yeah, because there were two sections in your faction thing, and I thought we talked about going forward with the second one, and the second one had a bunch of stuff about like a relationship tree or diagram or something like that to kind of show you how your factions are doing.
Is that the faction system design implementation card?
Well, I'm talking more about like the presentation to the player.
I think that one would almost look like an actual stock ticker, but instead of having the company abbreviation, you would actually have the faction symbol and faction abbreviation.
Let me restate the question. What task talks about it?
I would think the design implementation is the task that we would break down to have more cards, and some of those implementation pieces would be visual implementation, as opposed would be UI, UX implementation, and code implementation.
Okay,
should we make a checklist under that? And then like under faction visuals, I'm gonna add the description, faction iconography,
Yeah,
and
we should add details. Yeah.
and character and one character.
I
No character? Okay.
I mean,
Faction icon.
I think we should stick with the faction icon. I think character is a bigger thing of how we want to deal with that across multiple runs. Like, is there a character that just shows up every single time, all the time, forever?
Oh, you're right.
They're the immortal being, or how do we want to handle that?
Yep.
I'm not against it, but also like how we have characters in our game and portraits and stuff is just a whole. It's a whole thing. That is probably not right now.
Down. I'm moving that card down. So all the resource ones are to get clumped at the bottom.
Cool.
I think taking on, after reading the faction stuff and taking on resource stuff and what we can implement there, I think there's plus whatever comes out of Steam. I think that's going to be enough for Spread 8.
Yeah.
You're muted, Hans.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah.
Pretty hefty.
So the thing is, 9 also has faction stuff as well.
Mm-hmm.
What about that stuff?
I think
is that stuff we might want to decide on after we do this? Do we want to continue on? Because this is like the more, I kind of think, out there kind of things.
Yeah. I mean, I think certainly, I actually think information reliability gets kicked back to either advisor or dignitary.
I'd probably put it under advisor.
Factions already own ships.
They do, but this was like, I think this is something George was talking about. Like, it was a deeper level of like ownership.
And this was you have agency of like, hey, house, please go manage my agrarian economy for me. And they either love that because they're agrarians, or they hate that because they hate doing work. And so that changed how that stuff performed and your thing, but also made it where you didn't necessarily need to worry about it as much or something. I don't know how much of that stuff is relevant. So that was what was left over in the faction expansion card. So whether or not we want to do any of that is probably a question mark, but that's what these are the last 3 cards we had originally in the faction expansion.
Yeah.
I mean, do we want to leave them there and see what happens with what we do in the first 2 weeks?
Yeah.
Is there stuff we want to specifically call out that we need to work ahead of any long-range update and start building features that would be multi-sprint features there?
So we've do we have we have some stuff already. The Galaxy Generation design time in Sprint 8, which is the important piece to going into like building that stellar map. And I think we even have we've talked about visuals for the stellar map. Tyson made up those mock-ups, kind of like where we were like, okay, we can get to there. Jump options, major update around ship types, actions, events. Oh,
is it a content push?
It's a content push card.
Cool.
Honestly, I mean, that can be in that update, but it's that's the art and UI is in there. Level design of stellar map should be up next to this stuff.
I have a card request. I want to do a visual overhaul of our actions and make sure that all of them are reflected inside the game. So like when you're scanning, you have a scanning thing. It's not just a bar filling up.
Yeah. Oh, you mean actual like the visual effects layer too.
Well, like a ship could fly to a planet and it could start putting VFX over the planet.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Whatever.
Yeah, a VFX layer.
Is that just a backlog card, or are you specifically calling for it in Release 9?
It's a good question. I feel like the sooner the better, but I feel like the thing that holds us up on this is a resource that I am not. So it's not really clear to me when we'd be able to do it.
Which resource is that?
Art,
VFX,
UI, UX.
animations, meshes.
Material work.
No, we have Hans.
I think there
That's
are some.
true.
I think there are some of these things that we can probably start to work on, and I think creating a card in the long range update makes sense. If we have, I don't think really create a release 9, but I think in the long range update, if we can start to, if in release, let's see, we're gonna go to Steam on release 8, right?
Yep.
So let's put a card in release 9 to do a VFX/UX brainstorm, and then in that we can come up with like what our goal, like what our aspirations are, and in that then we can identify the aspirations that we feel like we can fulfill with the resources we have at hand and flag the ones that we can't. Then we can take a look at where could we schedule those and what those might cost us, and then do the work for the ones we can during the long range update as part of the art and UI overhauls.
Makes sense.
In 9, VFX UX brainstorm in 9, and then art UI overhauls. We populate that card with what we can in 9. It populate it in 9, execute it in 10, in whatever the long range update, where that pops out. With the idea that then we also take a look at what our aspirational goals are, so we can size out, like what kind of contracting would we need, and where are we in terms of our Steam revenue?
Yeah. We still have a backlog. We can go through that when it's time for planning. That's fine.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty good with what we have listed in release 8.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think release 8 is pretty good. Release 9 feels more.
I actually don't think it's going to be light. I think it's going to be a number of us working directly on the stellar map and the long range stuff, and then a whole big chunk of people working on like, hey, make every other part of the game better right now.
Yeah. I wasn't going to say light. I think I was going to say vague and hand wavy, but that feels appropriate since we're waiting to see what comes out of Steam.
Yeah, because I have a feeling release 8 is going to be a shitload of capture. We're going to be capturing a ton of shit that we need to do.
Yep.
I personally feel like going vague with release 9 is probably a safer bet, just because we're going to have marketing reaction to do, we're going to have customer service reaction to do, and we have no idea what the loads on those are going to be. They could be nothing and awesome, then we add more cards in from the backlog.
Yeah.
Yep. And I think that we're also going to figure out more about what our long-term plan should be. So I don't know that it's really worth jumping into any of the longer-term updates that we have in the thing either. Cool. So this can be a short one. If you guys think of anything you want to add before planning, please don't hesitate to put it in, especially if there's any long-term stuff that we're not capturing. I mean, obviously we're focused on design and sort of feature stuff, but just feel free to throw it into backlog or wherever else. Cool.
Yeah. Cool.
Thanks, guys.
No problem. Hans.